In a city the size and age of Sheffield, it's inevitable there'll be some interesting stories tucked away somewhere in its history. Take the story of St Paul's and the Peace Gardens in the city centre, for example. For that we need to go back to around 1700 in the reign of Queen Anne. The population of Sheffield had been growing steadily through the 1600s, and by then it was just over 6,000. Very tiny by today's standards. But in a period when everyone, either because of conscience or law, expected to go to church, the ancient parish church of the Holy Trinity, which today we call Sheffield Cathedral, was too small for all its parishioners. And for decades up to 1700, Sheffield had been a hotbed for dissenting religious groups such as Presbyterians, Quakers and Catholics. The nonconformist Upper Chapel in Norfolk Street alone had a congregation of over 1,000. That's 1/6 of the population. But even allowing for the large number of dissenters, the town's Anglican elders decided it was time to build another church, which they would dedicate to St Paul. A site was chosen about 400 metres from the parish church off Pinston Croft Lane, on the southern edge of the town close to open ground, then called Allsop Fields. Pinston Croft Lane is now known as Pinstone Street, and the site, of course, was the area we call the Peace Gardens. A fine English Baroque church was completed in 1721 by Platts of Rotherham as a chapel of ease, a quaint name for a subsidiary to the main church within the same parish. It had seating for 1,200 people, and its design was clear evidence that Sheffield was becoming bigger and wealthier. But then the story descends into farce. For while it took just over 1 year to build St Paul's, it took the next 19 years to choose its first minister. Here's why. Although the building itself was financed mainly by public subscription, the whole project was largely made possible by a gift of £1,000 and the promise of £30 a year from a man called Robert Downes, a wealthy Sheffield goldsmith with a shop in the marketplace. In return for this largesse, the Downes family expected to be able to appoint the new church's ministers. But there was a problem. As it was a chapel of ease to the parish church, the vicar of Sheffield, John Dossey, maintained it was he should appoint the new minister, not Robert Downes, and refused point blank to budge. To make things worse, William Jessup of Broom Hall, whose family had been the patrons of the parish church for over 150 years, maintained it was in his gift to choose the new minister, and he refused to budge as well. The squabbling parties even appealed to the Archbishop of York to intervene, but he wisely decided to keep well out of it. Amazingly, this three-way standoff continued for nearly 20 years, during which time the church remained locked and unused. Things were finally brought to a head in 1739 when Robert Downes, piqued at seeing his pride and joy lying empty for so long, decided to certify the church under the Act of Toleration as a meeting house for Protestant dissenters. Well, he should have done it a lot sooner. That set the parish authorities scrambling to avoid losing the church, and a compromise was quickly agreed through Act of Parliament, and St Paul's was finally consecrated in November 1740. Robert Downes did get one of his wishes, however. His nephew John became the first curate, and in one of his rousing sermons in the middle of the Jacobite Rising in 1745, John Downes got all his P's in a row and denounced Bonnie Prince Charlie as a popish prince and a pest to a Protestant people. In 1755, further funds were found to fit an organ, and a dome and a clock followed in 1769. The organ was made by one of Europe's greatest organ builders, John Snetzler. You can still see an example of his stunning work in Beverley Minster, and was renovated in the 19th century by one of the only companies in England capable of it, Brindley and Foster, just a few hundred metres away in Suffolk Road. Performances of sacred music on a grand scale by distinguished vocalists were given in St Paul's, including the Spanish mezzo-soprano Maria Malibran, one of the most famous opera singers in the 19th century and a favourite of Rossini, Chopin and Mendelssohn. She died tragically in Manchester in 1836, aged just 28, after a fall from her horse. There was also an interesting marble memorial to a much-loved curate of St Paul's, the Reverend Alexander Mackenzie, by a sculptor called Francis Chantrey, almost unknown today but one of the most acclaimed portrait sculptors in Regency England, whose many subjects range from 2 English King Georges to George Washington, whose statue now stands in the State House in Boston, Massachusetts. Why did such an illustrious figure come to work in Sheffield? Because Chantrey was born in Norton, then a village to the south of the town, and spent his formative years working as a portrait artist in Sheffield, at the same time as Reverend Mackenzie was curate at St Paul's. So what happened to St Paul's? The breakneck growth of Sheffield in the 19th century led to large areas of slums in the 20th. The slum clearance programme and the building of new housing estates meant that by then St Paul's city-based congregation had disappeared into the suburbs, and so the site was eventually sold off for £135,000 by the church commissioners, and the church demolished in 1938. The area of demolition, you can see, was scheduled for an extension of the town hall, but the Second World War intervened and the plans were shelved. Instead, the area became St Paul's Gardens. But after Neville Chamberlain's Peace in Our Time speech, after the Munich Agreement, they were nicknamed the Peace Gardens. The name stuck and finally became official over 40 years later in 1985. In 1977, Sheffield Council finally got its wish and a new town hall extension was built, looking very much like an alien craft from the planet Eggbox. Unlike the renovated Peace Gardens, it wasn't popular and was demolished just after 25 years in 2002 to make way for the Winter Gardens and the new St Paul's area of plush apartments, offices and restaurants. Back in 1938, in the good old Sheffield tradition, everything that was removed from St Paul's Church was sold off or recycled. The organ went off to All Saints in Wingerworth, while the Chantry Memorial to Reverend Mackenzie was moved to Sheffield Cathedral. The stonework was reused in several places, including these houses in Trap Lane in Bents Green, complete with decorative motifs and 200 years of soot. As there had been no burials since 1855, when city centre burials were banned in England, all the 8,000 grave and headstones were removed and the remains were exhumed and reburied in Abbey Lane Cemetery under one large stone cross. St Paul's was a popular burial place for many of the wealthier members of Sheffield society, and some famous people buried there included at least 3 master cutlers, and Thomas Bolsover, the inventor of Sheffield plate, who died in 1788. Finally, there is still just a little of the original 18th century St Paul's area that has survived. In 1720 there was some land left over from the building of the church, and this was sold to Edward Cheney for £93. By 1730 he had built several houses on it around a small square called Cheney Square, which you can see in this print with St Paul's in the background facing onto Pinstone Street to the right. Most of this area was flattened in 1897 to accommodate Sheffield Town Hall, but the little walkway you can see at the end running along the railings was, and still is, called Cheney Row, and which today runs between the Town Hall and the Peace Gardens. In this engraving by the famous architect and artist Edward Blore, looking at the back of St Paul's this time, you can see a lady with her baby sitting on the steps at the end of Cheney Row looking out onto Norfolk Street, with the green fields of the Sheaf Valley and the Old Deer Park on the hills in the distance. Today, of course, she won't be able to see any further than the hotel across the road, the Mercure St Paul's Hotel. Well, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.